Yep, you heard me mention it a moment ago, and rising concerns around a potential tax revolt in South Africa. Now, some of us might say, well, this might not likely happen, given that SARS actually reported record revenues in the last financial year and continue to put in measures in place to make sure that South Africans, businesses, and in the individual capacity remain compliant. But the truth is, you need a willing population who will be able to be transparent and compliant with tax services in order to make sure that we avoid a tax revolt. To tell us more, we join on the line by Jashwin Baijoo, Head of Strategic Engagement and Compliance at Tax Consulting South Africa. Jashwin, great to have you with us and always a pleasure to speak to you, sir.
Good evening, Gugu. Thanks so much for having me, and good evening to the listeners.
Fantastic. This one's an interesting one because typically we talk to you about some of the changes that would be implemented at SARS and what we need to be mindful of as taxpayers. But this really speaks to a broader theme and falls right under your umbrella regarding compliance. And maybe let's talk about the culture of compliance within the South African context. Has that been improving?
Look, so if we look at it from a perspective of culture of compliance, and I've been asked this question many times over the preceding months. The culture of compliance is twofold. It is SARS on one side implementing strategic intents, one of which is to make non-compliance hard and costly for taxpayers who are willing or negligently, intentionally being non-compliant. And on the other side, we have the intent of making compliance easy and sometimes seamless. Now, as much as those are admirable intents, you have to look at it from a perspective of not everything is being done to actually put forth those intents. Mm-hmm. So if we look at something as simple as the increased scrutiny on registration for VAT, I mean, practically your VAT and your refund fraud does not take place at registration. It takes place at fraudulent invoicing and the claim itself. So what has happened is it's now almost coming across as a deterrent for those who want to be voluntarily compliant to now process their VAT registrations. And then on the other side, you've got things like the approval international transfer, which has ultimately increased the evidentiary and documentary burden to be discharged by the South African resident who wants to be compliant, but must now submit this entire list of documentation simply to be able to move their own money offshore.
Ah, man. And this raises a number of concerns, right? Because typically we think, okay, we understand you need the increased disclosure to, build about trust and, of course, clarity and compliance. But also, one would assume that, SARS would be more lenient, especially to those who have come forward, instead of, having to wait for people to be reluctant and then introduce additional programs like the voluntary disclosure program. Talk to us about this theme and how successful it's been and perhaps how it can be improved upon.
Yeah, so SARS's introduction of something like the voluntary disclosure program was very well received by the market. And you'll recall initially it was a temporary relief measure for non-compliant taxpayers to come forth and not face the interest and penalties that come with that disclosure. And now it's, because of its popularity and the fact that they've seen an increase in compliance statistics, the voluntary disclosure program has now been made a permanent fixture at SARS. Similarly, things like the tax debt relief solutions, where again, it's non-compliant taxpayers who simply cannot afford to settle their tax debt, which has maybe snowballed over a number of years or completely unexpected, and usually it's the interest and penalties that really snowball over time. And these relief mechanisms, the VDP, the tax debt compromise, the deferral of payment arrangement, they're geared towards enhancing compliance by increasing compliance statistics, making it easier, less costly for taxpayers to become compliant. But from a success perspective, it's very successful for SARS because either way, they're still making their collection. For the taxpayer, when these relief mechanisms have been applied for successfully, it is favorable to the taxpayer because they do not bear the brunt of the interest and penalties having to be paid to SARS in addition to the capital tax.
I understand what you mean. So, and with this heightened level, I guess, of voluntary disclosure and, of course, these incentives that are put in place, does it mean then that potentially a tax revolt would be impossible? And is it illegal in a country like South Africa to just say, I choose not to be compliant?
Look, so impossible and illegal, two very different questions.
Yep.
I mean, there's always the possibility. And if we look at public sector wage negotiations, that quite often goes sour, and then there's a bit of a peaceful protest, and ultimately government comes around at some stage, or they meet the unions halfway. But if it were to be a case of a flat no, and the economy comes to a standstill, with the economy at a standstill, what would taxation be levied on? I mean, a number of sectors and your basic labor force still work on a no work, no pay principle. And if there's no pay, there's no gross income for tax to be levied on, which means ultimately it's almost like a tax walkout. Granted, it's a peaceful protest, but if it's ongoing, it does diminish the contribution to the tax base, firstly. And secondly, I mean, silly example, but over the course of COVID, there were a number of businesses that withheld their PAYE and simply never paid it over to SARS in favor of keeping their workforce gainfully employed and not going through salary cuts for their employees. And, as admirable as that is from a moral standpoint, that is still technically some form of a tax revolt because you have now made a conscious decision to not pay your taxes over, which is contrary to the law. So the question of legality then steps in. And it is a case of, something as simple as the non-submission of a tax return or withholding submission of a tax return, to correctly quote the legislation, does become a criminal offense.
Got you.
And that's in black and white. Yeah,
it definitely is a criminal offense. But I guess we also need to look at this in terms of matching the mood of the country. Jashwin, we actually posted about this conversation on our Facebook page and asked many South Africans, are they feeling reluctant and disgruntled in terms of being compliant with their taxes, and not just direct taxes that they are impacted by, such as PAYE and the likes. But many are coming forward to say, well, we're not getting services in this country. I don't want to pay my costs and my fees. I don't want to pay my taxes. I don't want to pay things like my TV license and other aspects. And this could lead to, I guess, silent levels of revolt. Your thoughts, I guess, on what this not only means for the taxpayer, but the risk that it also could lead to for the economy.
Yeah, look, I mean, if you look at it from that perspective, and that's actually a discussion I had with my marketing team earlier today, just prior to this interview regarding the marketing for the interview. And it's one thing to say, okay, listen, poor service delivery. And I think at this stage, the service delivery in South Africa is beyond poor. It's almost non-existent. I mean, look at Eskom as an example. There's your prime example. Forget about TV licenses and e-tolls and things like that. Let's look at Eskom. Almost non-existent service delivery, but where do the funds for financing these public organizations come from? In a large part, they come from the tax base, right? So understanding the mindset of South Africans is fairly easy. I'm paying, but I'm not getting a service. It's the same as if you were to walk into, call it a mechanic store, and he tells you, listen, give me 10,000 Rand. And I will look at your car.
Yes.
And then he literally stands there and looks at it.
Ooh, I'd be so upset.
There we go. It's literally the same principle. I mean, probably a bit of a dumbed down example, but it's exactly the same. You pay for a service, there's no delivery, you are going to be upset, as you just said. Now, that's all good and well, but look at it from the other side. A case of you're already paying those taxes. Those taxes are being used to finance multiple government operations for service delivery. And your service delivery is at 1 out of 10. suddenly you decide tax revolt, but then you're revolting in rolling blackouts because your service delivery goes to 0 out of 10. So sometimes you've got to pick the lesser evil.
Sure. And that, really speaks to, re-educating us as South Africans, because you're right, you need to pick the lesser evil and, raise your expression and your frustrations, but through the appropriate channels, which I would presume would then, be through elections, through institutions that are present to actually make sure that your concerns are understood. And maybe that does take us again back to the fundamentals of this conversation, Jashwin. Engagement and compliance. This is where we as taxpayers, regardless of how we do feel, still need to make sure that at the end of the day, the numbers make sense. Our levels of compliance with SARS are in order, because fundamentally we'll still feel the wrath and pinch of it all through penalties, fees, interest as well that might accrue. Talk us through that psychology. Where we almost damned if you do, damned if you don't, but also understand that there's a benefit in the long term to adequately being compliant with your taxes.
Look, that's 100% correct. And going back to the very crux of it, compliance is always first prize. Historic, current, future. That's your first prize. But where it is beyond that and it's beyond reproach, then any compliance-related aspect should take a legal element into consideration, and remedying that non-compliance quite often requires legal involvement, not just in guiding South Africans to ensure their compliance, but also in engaging SARS. We found that they're far more amicable to some sort of settlement or whatever the case may be, where the correct legal process is followed and the correct applications in the correct substance and form are what are submitted to SARS, correctly discharging any burden of proof. And ultimately, if you want to go down to the very root of the compliance issue in this country, it very simply stems from a lack of financial education.
Yes. I
mean, if you think about it, high schoolers, you matriculate at the age of 18. Let's say you go work in retail or you work as a waiter or whatever the case may be. At that stage, you're earning an income, but you have no idea what a tax return is. You have no idea how it works or the tax bracket. And I mean, my personal sentiment on that is, if we can first address the systemic issue of a lack of financial education in the country at a secondary or even at a tertiary level, but ideally at a secondary level, because it is that results in the vast majority of our youth not reaching tertiary level, and furthermore end up adding to the already high unemployment rate. So financial education, even if it is something as simple as how to invest, how taxes, that should all be part of the syllabus for life orientation, or introduce an additional subject in school, financial literacy or something like that, because that is the very core of the issue we are dealing with as a country.
Definitely. Sure, Jashwin, we've covered a lot, and I guess, it's awakened me to a much broader conversation that you say. It goes back to the fundamentals of making sure you're compliant, but also the psychology of a nation is heavily influenced by actually witnessing how the hard-earned cash that we work so hard for, the tax contributions that we make, they should translate into adequate service delivery, which will enhance our quality, enhance our level of contribution and even levels of compliance. So it really seems, a lot broader, but you've helped in educating us and creating a sense of awareness around this. Truly appreciative of your time as always, Jashwin, and I guess we'll be speaking to you soon as everyone starts actively participating in the tax filing season.
Thanks so much, Babu. Have a good one.